Hello, everybody. You're about to meet Minal Bopaiah. She has written this fabulous book called Equity, How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives. I read the book with amazement. She uncovered aspects of equity I had never even thought about. Her company is called Brevity and Wit. They use design principles to help leaders and all of us achieve the changes we want to see. Here's Manal. Hello, everybody. I am delighted to introduce to you Minal Bopaiah, who has written an absolutely fabulous book called Equity, How to Design Organizations Where Everyone Thrives. Now, before I say something about her, I want to say that this book had me completely enthralled. I literally started trembling as I was reading some of it because she put into words stuff that I had been thinking and didn't have the terminology for. What she does, we know about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Most people get what diversity is. They can even figure out inclusion, but that equity thing, cracking the equity code, that's her specialty. And so that's what we will delve into. She is a author. I already said that. She has a book, strategic consultant, she has her own company, Brevity and Wit. She specializes in what's called design-centered, how would you say that, Manal?
Design thinking or human-centered design.
Human-centered design. That's her specialty. Okay, so welcome, Manal.
Thank you, Jean. It's really a delight to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I have so many notes. We won't get to it all in the time that's allotted. Okay, so I'm going to show you this wonderful slide that you have in your book. Please explain to us the difference.
Yeah, so this image was created by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's available online, and actually they've updated it recently. But the main concept holds that, it is a great visual demonstration of how equality is about giving everybody the same thing, and equity is about giving people the resources they need according to their differences so they can participate fully. Yeah, so it's an old concept dating back to English law, I believe in the 15th or 16th century. And it's really this understanding that the law cannot be equal unless there is this idea of accommodating for context and for differences. And so equity is really important to justice. Now, I will say that in recent times, people have begun pitting equity and equality against one another as if one is better than the other. People on the left saying that we should only focus on equity, people on the right saying we should focus on equality, generally speaking. And I don't believe that it's true that we can throw out one over the other. I think they're both really important. I think, and the example that I often give is marriage equality, right? In the late 90s and early 2000s, some LGBT groups were pushing for civil unions, but then they realized that they would have the legal precedents for separate and fundamentally unequal treatment under the law. And they realized they had to go for marriage equality. And so the way I say it is that we need equitable structures in order to have equal human rights and equal access to opportunity. And that equity and equality are opposite sides of the same coin of justice. It's a bit like yin and yang, right? That you need both of them in order to have something that's whole and complete. You cannot simply focus on equity and throw out all arguments for equality. It will create legal problems that will allow certain people to be treated one way and another group of people to be treated another way. You cannot simply have equality and throw out equity because people are different and they have different needs and different circumstances.
Ah, okay. Now I get it.
Yeah. So you need both to really be able to have justice in the world.
Okay. I got that. All right. So let's go to what keeps us from achieving equity.
Yeah.
And in your book, you had these wonderful three factors for what keeps systemic racism in the US. And systemic racism, you're really careful to point out, it's just the example you're using, but this applies to all forms of inequity, right? It's not
Mhm.
just racism. The thing that you said that had me so spellbound was you said racism is one of the hardest nut to crack. You didn't put it
Mhm.
that way. So why don't you, let's see, before I go into the three factors, what you pointed out, systemic racism is harder to address. It's the more polarizing. That was the term you used.
Yeah. I think it's the more polarizing one. I will say that the system of oppression that I think is actually the most entrenched is ableism.
Oh,
That
that's interesting.
because we are at a point in history where we can, most people will generally agree that you should not imprison somebody based on the color of their skin or their race. We are still at a point in time where certain diagnoses, particularly mental health diagnoses, can justify imprisonment or make people think that that person should be in prison. And so we are not yet at the time where we can um, treat people with full dignity when we have knowledge of their medical diagnoses or disabilities.
That's absolutely true. So here's the paradox. Here is where I get stuck on that.
Mhm.
Distinguishing when someone's disability, including mental disabilities, is something to flex to and accommodate versus something that prohibits them from doing the job.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you address that?
I think to do that, you have to be very intentional about scoping jobs and being clear what are qualifications versus what are preferences, right? So, so for if I use myself as an example, um, I have a terrible poker face. I'm not interested in developing a poker face. I'm really good at telling the truth. I think that makes me a good writer. But not having a poker face makes me a terrible PR person or spokesperson for And I understand that my differences is a strength in some environments and a weakness in others, right? So so if there is a job like being the spokesperson for the president of the United States, I would not be qualified based on my lack of a poker face, right? Um, most other jobs, that should not be a requirement, right? With some exceptions, probably. Um, Actually, my husband's a firefighter and a paramedic, and you kind of want somebody with a good poker face who won't look panicked when you may be in distress, right? So I may not be that great at patient care in that sort of situation. Um, so I think you need to get really clear about when are certain things like neurodivergence. We have a couple of consultants who are very transparent about having ADHD or other neurodivergent needs. It's fine for knowledge work. When we're talking about knowledge work, most of these things do not get in the way. When we're talking about other things that are emergency services, or um, things that require more interaction with the public, then they may be. Um, so I think you have to be, and I can't speak, disability is a big umbrella. There are lots of different disabilities. And so you have to get very clear about what are the things that can be accommodated that don't affect the quality of services that are being delivered, and what are the things that really are disqualifying for the needs of the position.
Okay. So the main thing is I'm trying to think as you're talking, I'm trying to think of examples. I know in
Yeah.
Hollywood, for an example, they set up gender and looks as something that's required for an actor. And so for an actor in a role, they may have a certain, so they can discriminate basically. They don't have to put uh, a
I mean, I
short,
don't, yeah, I mean, they're pushing back on looks. Like they
yes.
are, that is a preference, not a requirement. Um, Gender, I think, is debatable because there are plenty of trans actors and actresses in Hollywood who have played across gender, some that we don't even know about because they were so closeted. Um, and I think Shonda Rhimes is doing a lovely job with Bridgerton and showing that you can have people of different hues and ethnicities in this world, so long as you create a world that makes it believable.
Yeah. So the example that came to mind was if the actor is supposed to tower above other people and is known for being tall, you can't put a 5 foot one guy in that role. So you
I
can't,
mean, if the role calls for it, yes. If the role doesn't call for it, then it's a preference, not a qualification.
right. So, but that's the critical distinction.
Yep.
If the role calls for it. And so that's back to what you said. Is this a mandate? Is this a requirement for the job, or is it a preference?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So let me go ahead to this thing I want to get to. 3 obstacles to talking about systemic racism.
Mm.
I'm going to say each one, and then would you elaborate on that? And if you have an example,
Sure.
so much the better. Okay. So you said one obstacle is what you called the progress and personalization narrative.
When people evoke this idea that like we've been making progress or that racism is just interpersonal and so therefore we're done because nobody's doing that anymore, it gets in the way of talking about systemic racism. It doesn't allow for the opportunity to talk about like, yes, we've made some progress, but there are still things that are entrenched in our system that have nothing to do with interpersonal relations that are perpetuating systemic racism.
Okay, so you spend a whole chapter on not being able to see systems.
Yes.
Why can't people, this is one of my great frustrations and why I loved your book. Why why don't people see systems?
One, I think there is a deliberate attempt by people who support systems of oppression to make the system invisible. We're seeing that right now with the backlash against DEI and the erasing of African American history from college AP classes, from school curricula, things like that, right? If you make it invisible, then people think that this is the natural order of the world. They
Right.
like not teaching it is a way to get people to comply with it.
Okay. So do you draw a connection between the progress and personalizations uh narrative and people not being able to see systems?
I think the progress and personalization impedes people's ability to talk about racism. I don't think that talking about progress impedes people's ability to not see the system. I think not being educated on the fact that there is a system impacting their life is what impedes their inability to see it.
Okay. So let's go to the belief in rugged individualism,
Yeah.
which is the second thing you said that keeps people from seeing systemic racism.
Yeah, I mean, it's this fundamental belief that we can, that the world is neutral and people are a product of their own hard work, and that's it. And the way that I've started to illuminate this in my talks is talking about how we think the equation is like hard work equals success, and that if you pour more into one bucket, then the other bucket rises. But it's really a multivariable equation where it's hard work and system support equals success. And often when somebody's not experiencing success, we look to the hard work variable, but it's actually the system support that we need to look at. They're off because there are plenty of people working hard who are not rich or experiencing career success or personal success, right? And it's because the system is not supporting them.
Now, what's fascinating to me about that is the way I usually talk about it or hear people talk about it is hard work plus luck. But
Yeah,
you're not putting luck in the equation. You're putting system support in.
luck is a proxy for system support.
Okay?
Like luck is another way of saying the system supports me and centers people like me. And I mean, listen, there is always a little bit of luck in life, you know, and I get that, but I think it is a smaller variable than we think it is, and most of the time it's system support. It's you're in the right place at the right time because you're white and you have access to the right places at the right time, or you're a man and you're on the golf course and that's where business deals are getting made, right? Like that is not luck. That's an entire system of commerce being conducted in places that are more friendly to men than women, right? So we need to separate out this idea of luck versus this idea of how the system runs.
Whoa. Okay, so let's stay with the golf course.
Hmm.
The rugged individualists would say, and I've heard some women say, I don't like golfing, but I'm playing it because
Yeah,
I have to do that.
yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I mean, that's your choice and your preference. What I'm saying is that I shouldn't have to engage in, like, not that I shouldn't have to, but that there are people, particularly straight white men, who do not have to engage outside their comfort system to put themselves in the way of opportunity. They get to be comfortable while opportunity is floating around them.
Okay.
And some of us don't. And I think we all should be able to.
Okay, so system support. What do you think of the phrase bring your whole self to work?
I think slogans are bad ways of teaching DEI. I think that's a very loaded phrase.
Okay.
Um, I think in some ways it's a nice sentiment to have. But if your whole self um happens to be racist, you can keep that part of you at home. I think it sets young people up for a misunderstanding of what work is, where they start to not have boundaries. And I think that's very dangerous, you know. I think boundaries is a big part of trust, and I think discretion is important. Yeah, and that being said, I think if your whole self, like if your self is gay, yeah, you should be able to talk about your relationship at work, like any straight person could, right? So I think there's an intention, a good intention behind that slogan, but when you shorten something to a sound bite without offering context, I think it can be applied inappropriately
Sure.
and cause damage.
Okay. So let's go back to this rugged individualism. The question I'm asking you is we were raised, this country emphasizes the cowboy, rugged
Mm.
individualist who
Yeah.
goes out and does the hard work. Your counter is yes, but people do that and don't have financial success. System support, how does system support fit in with the ideology of rugged individualism?
Yeah, I mean, it counters it. Listen, the world is fundamentally interdependent. No man is an island. Interdependence is one of the few things that both religion and science agree on, right? Um, and so, but this belief in rugged individualism is so entrenched in our society that it really like causes some damage. The example is the pandemic, right? Like we live in an interdependent world where the air we breathe is the air that our neighbors breathe. And yet during the pandemic, we didn't talk about, you know, the medical infrastructure that would allow people to be treated in a timely manner or get fair and equal access to treatment. We didn't talk about HVAC systems in our buildings and how that controls the air quality. We talked about vaccinations and masks that were left to individual decision making, which is not sufficient for addressing a system-wide problem, right? The problem is that you can't just point to one person when you're talking about HVAC. or one person when you're talking about medical records in our healthcare system. You can point to one person when you're talking about vaccines and masking, right? And so the measures of accountability are more complicated when you're talking about a system versus rugged individualism. And so it is easier to shame or blame an individual or blame people for their illness rather than to engage in a nuanced and contextual discussion of how the system failed that person and try to create policies and systems that don't fail people.
What you're saying is why I got so excited reading the book. The question that I keep having is, and why I'm looking at these three myths, uh, let me just go to the question I'm having is, how do we get people to see that? The three myths that you list here, the three myths that you list here are the ideologies that keep, as far as I can see, keep people from seeing systems.
Yeah.
So let me repeat:
Mm-hmm.
progress and personalization, belief
Mm-hmm.
in rugged individualism, and separate lives narrative, separate fates narrative is what you call it.
Yeah.
Okay, talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the separate fates narrative is basically this idea that what happens to one group of people, what happens to people who are unvaccinated doesn't affect me. That's basically what that separate fates narrative is saying. That's not true, right? Like when there's not enough herd immunity, like all of us suffer, like your children who are too young to get immunized may suffer, right? But more to that point, it erodes trust in society. There's all like we live in a multivariable equation. Like it's not, there is very little cause and effect. It is more, cause effect, something that causes something else that causes something, right? Like it is very, very, there are a lot of causes and conditions for anything that happens in our world. And it is a hard equation to tease out. And we try to simplify it, but the simplification is not serving us anymore, right? And so
Explain that, elaborate on that.
if we simplify it by saying things like, well, if you studied hard, you would do well in school and get a good job. But that does not take into account the history of redlining, the history of the fact that American schools are funded by property taxes, not by a general tax revenue, the way most other countries do it. And so your zip code or where your parents can afford to live very much influences your future trajectory. And we're not having those conversations in those ways. We're saying that like, well, you should be able to go to any school and study hard and get yourself out of that and become financially successful or whatever your definition of success is, right? And that's not the case. And so what we need to do in order to get people to see the system is, I think people who care about this work need to get better at actually studying the systems that they are trying to change. And you cannot be I don't think you can be an expert on every system. So you got to pick and choose which ones you're going to study, whether, for me, I do a lot of work with media. I care a lot about racism and sexism and ableism. Those are the systems of oppression and the systems of industry that I know really well. I'm not as strong probably on LGBTQ rights, or other rights like socioeconomic stuff as well. I have some knowledge in terms of how they intersect with race and gender and media and things like that. I'm not good at education. Like, well, no, I'm okay at education. I'm probably not good if you were to get me in a manufacturing company and understanding that whole system and how it operates and where the biases are, right? Because the first part, if we want to develop system sight, is that we have to start by explaining the system to people. Saying something is systemic racism is a black box, right? Saying it's the system, that can be used by any side of an argument. People on the left are using it to like say, yeah, the system is corrupt and that's why people of color are suffering. But people on the right are using it to say, yeah, the system is preferencing people of color and white men are being
That's
disenfranchised.
right.
And if you cannot explain the exact way in which the system is disenfranchising people of color, then don't be surprised when people who are white argue the same, the opposite thing and win, because nobody has done the work to really illuminate the details of how the system is working.
Okay, so let's stay with that. And again, this is why I'm fascinated with this book, because you're endeavoring to answer this question.
Yeah,
So you just said no one can say people say systemic racism without explaining the exact how.
yeah.
Can you pull an example
Mhm.
of where you went people help people move from seeing individuals
Yeah.
to seeing systems? Talk to us
Yeah,
about that. Take us through that journey.
sure. So I sort of do it in the introduction when I talk about my parents coming to this country relatively poor as Indian immigrants and running their own private practice, buying a home, sending their kids to college debt free. And it's all the trappings of the model minority myth, right? That like we work hard and that's why we do well. And the
Who is the
implication
we?
that Asians and Indians in particular work, the Asian model minority myth. And the implication being, the model minority, what's not being said is like in comparison to problematic minorities, which is super racist, right? So we don't say the racist part out loud. But the problem with this myth is that it's fundamentally built on a systemic advantage because, first of all, the only reason my parents came to this country is because of the civil rights movement in 1965, which advocated for the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. Before 1965, the US had a policy of handing out visas and green cards in order to preserve the homogeneity of North America, meaning the white majority. So without the civil rights movement, which was mainly mobilized by Black women, my parents would not be in this country, first of all. But even in that act of inclusion and justice, the system of racism evolved. And what happened is that the US immigration system began to take advantage of socialized education in other countries to provide for labor needs. We still do this today with HB1 visas that are given disproportionately to India to meet the needs for the tech workforce. And that's because in India, my parents, who were relatively poor, could go to college and medical school for what was rumored like $50 a semester, right? The US does not provide that sort of access to education to poor brown people in this country, right? And so when we say that, and that allowed my parents to come to this country debt free, they didn't have medical school debt the way they would if they had been raised in this country poor. And so when we say that Asians are a model minority or that, if they just work hard, it'll work out, it's, it's a false narrative at best, and it's very vicious gaslighting at worst. Because I think that, we have an education system in this country that not only isn't debt-free for medical school, but even before that, it's funded by property taxes. So where your parents live dictates where you go to school and how much funding that school gets. That's not how it works in India. There's a general tax revenue, as there is in like our European allies like Germany, right? And so that money is then distributed per capita, not per zip code. So there's more of a fair chance for a kid from any neighborhood to be able to study hard and get access to a good education and then go on to medical school. And so we don't do that here. And I believe that if we did, you would see just as many doctors with brown skin and poor parents as you do in the Indian diaspora, right? And so that is what I'm saying about understanding how the system is perpetuating racist outcomes.
Beautiful. When you said that the US is exploiting socialized medicine in other countries and bringing the beneficiaries of those socialized degrees
Mhm.
here, I was just flat blown away. I had never thought about it like that. I go in and out of the medical center here,
Mhm.
and they have the list of the names of all of the doctors and staff, and they are 80% of them are what's called foreign names. You can tell the people did not necessarily, the people or their parents or grandparents did not come from this country. And I looked at it and I thought, how is it that so many immigrants or first, second generation immigrants are flooding our medical centers?
Yeah.
And that's what you said. The US imports people who got degrees from other places.
Yeah, I mean, there was a perceived doctor shortage in the 60s and 70s, and so that is why they looked outside the country. I will also say, though, that the experience of racism, there's this racial triangulation that goes on between Blacks and Asians.
Yes.
And there's this great chart about it that, like, if you can imagine, on the y-axis is superior versus inferior, perceived superiority versus inferiority, right? So you might have whites at the top, Blacks at the bottom, and Asians somewhere in between. But then there's also an axis of being an insider versus being perceived as a foreigner, right? And so whites and Blacks are perceived as insiders, and Asians are perceived as foreigners. And so even though I was born and raised in the US, my name, Minal Bopaiah, may make people think that it's a foreign name, but unless you're from an indigenous tribe, all of us are foreigners,
Right.
right? And so it's really important that we understand that, yes, there is a history of anti-Blackness in the Asian community, right? Asians were part of the affirmative action overturning affirmative action. There is also a history of xenophobia in both the white and Black communities towards Asians.
Right.
And that has to be owned and dealt with. And that is a different system that is operating in concert sometimes and sometimes against this system of racial superiority.
Right. Yes. And I lived in New York City for a while where
Yeah.
the uh, Black versus Jewish, Black versus Latino, Black
Mhm.
versus Asian dynamic was all at play in
Yeah.
terms of who's Blacks were always considered at the bottom. But Blacks I know then got mad at the Jews, got mad at the Asians, got
Yeah.
mad at these other different groups and would talk trash about them also.
Yeah.
And so people just gravitate towards their own basically. And
Yeah. Or they think they're fighting over crumbs when there's a much bigger pie.
what's the much bigger pie?
I mean, the much bigger pie comes like when we have solidarity and like, listen, if you and I have beef because you and I have beef, that's one thing. If you and I have beef because somebody else has made this up and put us at odds, like we're getting played.
Right.
And so you got to decide, like, I'm not going to be used as a tool for white supremacy because all of that is just divide and conquer, like in the 21st century. And the only group that it serves is straight white guys.
So how do you get the people in this chart, the people who are viewed on the outside and inferior, how do you get them to see they're being played? When
I
they're
think,
busy, they're really busy fighting what's in front of them. This is back to
yeah,
what people not seeing system. They're fighting the people in front of them.
yeah. I mean, this is why you need good leaders who can explain the system to people and unify people in a direction. I think right now in DEI, we talk too much about what we're trying to destroy or take down and not enough about what we're trying to build.
Right. Okay. So I'm trying to pull up this next chart. You talked about how to unite people.
Mhm.
Can you talk through that model?
Yeah. I mean, you have to start with shared values
Yes.
and you have to um, talk about what you're building. Like, this is why I say that I do DEI or that I do racial equity. I often don't use the term anti-racism work, not because I think it's bad work. I think that there's a need for anti-racist policies, but the term anti-racism is just talking about what you're against. It doesn't help people envision what are you building. right? If we're
Right.
building racial equity, or if we're building racial inclusion, that gives people a much clearer vision, right? And then getting very specific about it. So I think good leaders have to also speak within their sphere of control, right? If you are running a nonprofit with 250 people, you're not going to end systemic racism.
Right.
Right? Like, that's a big thing. So you have to present a vision that is attainable for the size of your organization with the resources you have.
Okay, you described a situation in your book,
Mhm.
Haverford nonprofit that you led them through. Do
I'm
you know what
sure
I'm
I,
talking?
I'm sure I did, but I wrote the book so long ago now, I'm starting to what jog my memory, Jean.
Okay, well, let's take NPR. Let's take Doctors Without Borders. Let's take anybody, any group where
Mhm.
you went in as an equity consultant
Yeah.
and and help people see their situation a different way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. So first of all, it's a team effort. It's not just me.
Sure.
Uh, and I think our consultants are very skilled because first of all, we will not do an org-wide change effort without working with leadership. It doesn't work in an organization if you don't engage leadership. And often with leadership, it means answering some very difficult questions about what this work is and what it isn't. Right? We've done some work with public media and helping them understand, like, yeah, you're not going to solve systemic racism. And that's hard for journalists to give up because they're working in the media, they see all the stuff going on in society. And journalism is meant to address systemic ills. But I was like, your organization's DEI program is not, it can influence that through coverage, but it can't directly control the outcome of society. What we can control is how things are designed in this organization, right? And so helping both leaders and staff understand their sphere of control is important. And then taking them through a visioning exercise that was created by my friend Radhika Dutt who wrote a book called Radical Product Thinking that really focuses on what is the problem you're trying to solve. And every organization that does DEI should be able to answer the question, what problem is DEI solving? Because if you can't articulate that, then basically your DEI is either like a corporate social like responsibility initiative, or it's like a social calendar with like multicultural events. And listen, that's where some people are. I'm not saying multicultural events are bad, but that's not strategic DEI. That's not transformative DEI. And so you need to be able to articulate what is the problem that you're going to solve through a DEI initiative, and then be able to articulate that clearly enough to staff. And then after that, it is beholden upon directors and managers to be able to translate that vision into the specifics of what it means for somebody's job, right? On a 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, as my business partner likes to say, what is going to be different for my job as a result of this initiative? You know,
Okay, so is that at all levels up and down the organization? Or you're talking about the leader? How does that apply?
I think
So
the leadership,
with
yeah,
the media, you were dealing with reporters, right? So did you hone in just on the reporters?
we were dealing with the whole organization.
Okay.
So, the CEO, the C-suite, they're in charge of strategy, but then they have to equip their direct reports as managers and directors to be able to manage well, to be able to then translate that strategy into what does it mean for this department? And then each manager should be able to articulate what does it mean for each one of my direct reports.
Sorry? I want to hear success.
Yeah,
We're articulating now what?
yeah. And so when you're able to do that, you're shrinking the change to something manageable. And in being able to do that, we have seen across a number of organizations, the measure that we like, the thing that we like to measure most is trust. How much do I trust my leaders or my manager? And with interventions like this, with a clear vision, with ongoing project management and accountability mechanisms, we've seen, 20 percentage point increases in trust of leadership or managers, 20-30% increase. Like those are significant gains in like 2 or 3 years, right?
And the increase is because they got greater clarity of how their job fits in with the whole, how their job.
That and also working with leadership, doing a lot of leadership development to understand what can they be transparent about and what requires some discretion. How do you put in mechanisms of accountability? Um, how do you like we've worked with 2 organizations where the staff were asking for their strategic plans and the leadership were so annoyed. They're like, no, they know the strategy. I don't know why they're asking this. And we asked them like, well, can we have it? Can we have a copy of it? And they were like, well, it's not written down. And we were like, listen, in a remote workplace, you got to write these things down, right? Like the lack of leadership training in organizations is pretty profound. And so I think that's the place to really start before we talk about all of these systemic things we want to do. Because if leadership isn't trained on how to be transparent and how to manage change, then any change you put in place will not be sustainable, you know? So if you want sustainable change, you have to go slow and start with leadership and capacity building in leadership
And do
skills.
you do this? Does equity stay in the forefront, or do you have something else in the forefront as you do that work?
I think right now equity is not in the forefront. It's become a very polarized word. I think inclusion is a little bit easier to put in the forefront in the beginning. I think we get to equitable outcomes eventually, but I'm also not so sure how many, as I say in my book, equity is a big ask. And inclusion is hard enough. So
That felt like a thud.
I
So
know. Because the other thing is that I don't sit there and try to convince them that they should be.
you don't say that again?
I don't sit and try to convince anybody that they should
Oh,
be,
yeah, no.
right? I don't waste my breath. I wait until they're ready. Because I don't think it's a good use of my time. And I think very few leaders are that visionary. Those are few and far between where you get a visionary enough leader who's committed to equity, who's like, okay, let's really do some brave things here and move this.
So would you say in order, diversity is the easiest, then inclusion, and then equity?
I think inclusion is the easiest. You can do inclusion even if your staff is not diverse.
This is true.
So I think inclusion is the easiest, then diversity and introducing differences, and then equity.
And then ableism, because you put that
I put accessibility. Accessibility is
excessive.
also a subsection of equity. Like accessibility is like, I mean, I mention it because I think disability rights are particularly ignored. But if you're doing equity, actually accessibility is often the way to get people engaged on equity. They will understand the importance of making accommodations based on somebody's disability more than based on somebody's race or gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic.
Yes, you're so right. I
Yeah.
used to do gender before I did race,
Yeah.
and I would often do that first. And you're right, accessibility is even more common. And so that
Yeah.
would,
Even
people
though
can
it's the
get
most
that.
entrenched form of like oppression in some ways, it's the easiest way for people to get into equity work.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you want people to take away from this conversation?
Hmm. From this conversation.
What are the main points you want to emphasize?
Yeah. I think DEI work is very nuanced and complex. Um, and I also think it's a very noble profession, like medicine or education. Um, and therefore it should be compensated well. And it also requires a lot of intellectual rigor. Hmm. I think I want people to take away that system sight is very important. for understanding how we got to where we got and what to do now.
System sight, meaning understanding systems and historical evolution of systems. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
And I think that that this work is very nuanced. I think it's not easily summed up in a slogan. You know, and I think our conversation was indicative of that, right? Like you had so many follow-on questions to just like one concept, right? Like that's what this work is really about.
what do you want people to take away about the concept of equity?
That it is vital for justice and fairness in our world, that it has to be balanced with equality, and that it will only be achieved through incremental gains because the system is so complex, that it is a process of continuous improvement.
I am so glad you said that.
Yeah.
People want to solve the problem. How do we end racism? How do
Yeah.
we get this? How do we get all of this, everybody's head on straight?
That, I mean, for me, that's like somebody becoming a doctor and saying that, and asking them, when are you going to solve all illnesses?
What a
Like,
great,
we wouldn't do that. We would never expect that of a doctor. I don't know why we expect it of DEI practitioners. I think you know, like a doctor treats one patient at a time, specializes in a field of medicine or in an illness. DEI practitioners have to treat one organization at a time, specializing in either an industry or a sector or a type of oppression. Um, and you move forward collectively.
so Manal, how can people reach you?
Yes. So the book Equity is available wherever books are sold, on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, bookshop.org. We also have a website called theequitybook.com that you can go to. And then I would invite people to sign up for our newsletter at Brevity and Wit. It's just brevityandwit.com. There's a newsletter link on the homepage, and that's how they can stay in touch and hear what we're up to.
Okay, brevity and wit, the word and is written out, not the
Yep.
ampersand, right?
No, you can't have an ampersand in a URL
Oh,
as
that's
much as
right.
I
Okay.
do.
Okay, brevityandwit.com.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I certainly thank you for your time and expertise, and I thank you for writing a perfectly enthralling book.
Thank you, Jean. I really appreciate it. I
All
really
right,
appreciate it.
bye. I'm actually feeling sort of breathless. Finally, at last, I have a much clearer handle on what is equity. People talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as though we know what it means. We do know what diversity means. It's how different we are from one another. We also have a general idea of inclusion. It's the sense of how much do people feel they are a part of the organization. What many of us don't get is equity. This is what Manali's book, so brilliant. She breaks it down. This is why her book won an award, the book most likely to change the way nonprofits work. Here are my takeaways. She gave 3 reasons why it's so hard for people to see systems and therefore systemic racism or systemic anything. Number one, many people believe that racism occurs at the interpersonal level rather than at the systems level. Second is the belief in rugged individualism, that all it takes is hard work and personal agency and anyone can succeed. The third reason it's so hard to see systems is the belief that what happens to one person doesn't affect me. What happens to people over there doesn't have anything to do with what happens to me over here. People who believe those things are not likely to be able to see systems. My second takeaway is how she separated out structural support from love. It fascinated me. I have normally people say that it takes a combination of individual effort plus luck to succeed. What she added was structural support as a third element. Let's take property taxes, local property taxes to fund schools. Most of you know already that local taxes are highly inequitable as a school funding source. Children who go to poorly funded schools start out with a deck stacked against them no matter how hard they try. There will be standout individuals who will rise to the top no matter what, but across the board, on average, children from poorly funded schools will have a harder chance of success. This brings up another interesting point she made. Some people in this country are claiming they don't want to fund what they call socialized education. People should pay for their own higher ed. Meanwhile, we're, as a country, bringing in people from other countries who were funded by their governments to achieve their higher degrees. And we want them with their specialized skills to come over here and help us out since we're not funding our own citizens. Third and last, I appreciate her emphasizing that we're talking about incremental change. People have to be in this work for the long haul. In one of my blog posts, I referenced a meeting I attended where people said that when Obama was elected, they thought that meant racism had ended. I couldn't stop laughing at the very thought, and it still tickles me, that people would think that racism could just end. Manali is saying, focus and target your efforts and know that you're in it for the long haul because the change will be incremental. It was a pleasure to see how Manali's book complemented our own. Ours is Conscious Change, How to Navigate Differences and Foster Inclusion in Everyday Relationships. It will be published July 9th, and we are so excited. The book has already gotten great reviews, and I hope you will pre-order it.